we aren't out of this by a long shot.
Copy that. Fire just swapped over the backside towards us. 50 residents not evacuated out of the fire come over last night.
The Northern California fires.
Well, good morning, everybody. So this panel is a little bit different. Over the next 2 days, you're going to be talking a great deal about the strategic landscape, how it looks in the near term and how it looks at the horizon. And you're going to be talking about the weapons and the actors, the adversaries, and the conflicts. What we're going to talk about on this panel is the underlying plate tectonics. So what are the trends and the drivers that shape the strategic landscape, that create these conditions, that lead to the weapons and the adversaries and the conflicts? So this is all about context. Now, what I've asked this panel to talk about, and we're definitely going to talk about what the title is, but what I've asked the panel to talk about is to look ahead to 2025 and to do some thinking about what is our strategic preoccupation going to be in 2025? What are we going to be concerned about? What threats? What challenges? What is that landscape going to look like to us then? And so we're going to have the first half of our conversation will be about that. And then in the second half, we're going to transition over to, so how do we organize for that world? What kinds of institutions do we need? What's our military force structure supposed to look like? What international institutions do we need? Do we have the government, the governance, the means that we need to deal with that world we expect to see in 2025? Now, I've asked them to do something a little, and I'm going to set a little context myself before we jump into the discussion. But just so you know, I mixed it up a little bit with the actual how we're going to do this conversation. And I've asked the panel to do something akin to conference speed dating, which is we're going to start by, they're just going to give you a telegraphic list of what they think the biggest challenges or threats or trends, preoccupations are going to be in 2025 without a lot of explanation. We're not going to start with a disquisition. We're going to do this speed dating style, and then we're going to go back and look at that whole picture we have and have a discussion about what that landscape looks like. To prepare for this, I decided I wanted to look back. And I looked at Global Trends 2015, which was written in 2000. And of course, we're in the year that they imagined right now. And I was curious about how well they did at looking forward and anticipating. And they did very well indeed. They said that information technology would change everything. And that may not sound like a bolt out of the blue right now, but 15 years ago, you did have to have some imagination to say that it was going to change the world of commerce, that biotechnology would be changing everything, that there would be chronic financial volatility and a widening economic divide that would shape national security, that states would still dominate, but governments would be losing control over the means of governance. They said that the Middle East was going to be in chaos with violent extremist movements aimed at their own governments and at the United States, and that governments would be shaking to their foundations. They did say that there would be a lot of regional military conflicts, but not major state conflicts. So it was a pretty good mix. And even the places where they were wrong are interesting, and I hope we'll talk about, which is they said, for example, that South Africa would be consumed and completely destabilized by AIDS. So even the places where they weren't quite right, they said that water scarcity would be a huge problem by now. So even some of the places they were wrong may lead to some interesting discussion. So with that, let's jump right into our speed dating. And to do that, I will turn and introduce you to our panel. And for that, I'm also going to need a cheat sheet because, my goodness, these are impressive people with a lot of titles. First, immediately next to me is Nadia Bliss, who is the director of the Global Security Initiative at Arizona State University. And she's also a professor of practice, and this is the one I need to read, in the School of Computing, Informatics, and Decision Systems Engineering. Before she went to ASU, she was a group leader at Lincoln Laboratories. So you can say this is a very accomplished person. Next to her is David Gartner. And David also has a lot of titles, which is why I have to read it. Professor of Law, Associate Dean, Faculty Co-Director of the Center for Law and Global Affairs. To put it in a nutshell, he's looking at law and international means for dealing with non-state actors and trends and drivers. So he's a perfect person to have on this panel as well. And last but certainly not least is Colonel Troy Thomas. He is an active duty U.S. Air Force officer. At the moment, he is Director for Strategic Planning on the National Security Council, so he's one of the top strategists in our government. Before that, he was a top advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He has been deployed in the Middle East and in Homeland Defense missions, as an intelligence officer and a planner, and a very sharp guy. So we are.
A new NASA study predicts that by the end of the 21st century, the American Southwest and Great Plains are likely to experience longer and more severe droughts than at any other time in the last 1,000 years.
So recent droughts, such as the ongoing drought in California or in the Southwest, or even historical droughts such as the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, these are naturally occurring droughts that typically last several years or sometimes almost a decade. In our projections, what we're seeing is that with climate change, many of these types of droughts will likely last for 20, 30, sometimes even 40 years, even exceeding the duration of the long-term intense megadroughts that characterize the really arid time period known as the medieval climate anomaly.
So how can we peer into the planet's future? Researchers combine natural observations and harness the processing capabilities of powerful supercomputers. The scientists looked at 1,000 years of tree ring data and compared those records with soil moisture data from 17 different climate models in order to extend this drought information into the future. The models all show a drier world thanks to increased temperatures from human-induced climate change.
But these computer simulations, these climate models, really represent our best understanding of the physics and the workings of the climate system. They're tested extensively against observations, and at the end of the day, if we want to investigate future climate, they are really the only tool that we have to use.
How bad these droughts are likely to
Others
get.
that is connected to us. I think in particular, the manifestations of climate change, particularly in terms of extreme weather, certainly affects our security.
And I know we've talked too, and also it's in a lot of the defense and the national security strategy, not that we're talking about that right now, but is that it's an accelerator or a threat multiplier, right? That where you already have an unstable state and a violent movement, and then when you also add in water shortages and food scarcity and extreme weather and people have to move, that's when it turns into something more than just unhappiness, into instability. Is that a fair?
Absolutely. I would just say absolutely. I mean, it's not only they're not only threats in their own right because they're disruptive and they're destructive, but as part of the conditions that make communities ripe for mobilization, that exacerbate, compound conflict. Absolutely.
Just to pick up on that theme, I mean, so water shortage will be a source of conflict in the not too distant future, right?
Why?
I mean, we see Ethiopia is trying to harness the Nile, and Egypt may not let that happen, and that may turn into a violent conflict. Even today, in the context of the Middle East, we see strategic battles over the Mosul Dam, strategic, battles perhaps to come over the Fallujah Dam. So it's currently an issue, but I think it's these longer-term issues that we need to be thinking about. So here at home, we've got a 50% chance of a mega drought, a 30-year drought in my region in the Southwest, an 80% chance of one that'll be 10 years, which is as long as was the case in the Dust Bowl. What does that mean in terms of our food security here at home? This is not just a future problem. Sao Paulo is the largest city in Latin America, is running out of water as we speak, despite being in one of the most water-rich regions of the world. So what does that mean in terms of migrations across borders? What does that mean in terms of competition over resources to come? I think it'll be quite dramatic, unfortunately.
I think it's really important for people to understand that there have always been water challenges, and states have always had conflict and generally have worked it out without going to war. But we're entering an era when there's going to be absolute scarcity of some of these resources, and that's a different baseline. So it's hard to know how those things are going to get worked out. But
And
talk to us about how can we actually understand these complexities and how they interact?
So I think I'd like to actually pick up on a couple points that David also mentioned. So Ebola, the outbreak was rather significant, the most significant in the history of the outbreaks. And I think some of the scientists have observed that one of the reasons for this was the urbanization of the area where the outbreak occurred. And this is a perfect example where things are interconnected. So typically these outbreaks have been happening in rural regions as opposed to these densely populated urban regions. Similarly, dengue fever. There's studies out there that are showing that climate change is exacerbating dengue fever and potentially to catastrophic effects. So I think one of the things that we have to accept, so certainly from a technologist, academic, research perspective, is we have to get comfortable with uncertainty. We're not going to be able to have a perfect set of risk maps over everything. And I will say, identifying risk and areas of risk is probably one of the biggest challenges that we can address together as a community. So they're exquisite models. They're exquisite models of atmospheric patterns. They're exquisite models of, temperature rising. They're exquisite models of water resource management in various areas. And sometimes we're still sitting out there debating whether climate change exists. So I think there's a couple things here. One, we have to start to get the communities talking. So the disease community, the CDC, and the folks that are doing disease models, usually it's mathematicians that are working with bioinformatics type of folks, have to be talking to the people that are studying climate change and working together. That's a tremendous challenge, and I'll know we'll get into that a little bit later. The other component there, we have to appreciate the connectivity of everything. A lot of the times we have this tendency to study just the Southwest for the water, or just the Middle East, or just the Niger River Basin, or just something else. We have to appreciate that all of these things are tightly interconnected, which means understanding communication networks, understanding transportation networks, understanding all of those. And there are tools out there that you can use to start doing those sort of models, but there has to be an appreciation that we're not going to be able to come out with an answer. So as we're talking out to policymakers, it's not a matter of saying, look, we've solved it, or climate change done, or disease done, but that we've identified almost like a risk landscape that we can kind of evaluate with a variety of experts.
So you can model complexity to the degree that you can start giving options for how to manage risk?
To some degree, I think, without a doubt. So, complexity in complex systems is, a burgeoning science, and I think a lot of this ties back to study of networks, so relationships between entities, whether it's communication networks or social networks or infrastructure networks. There's tremendous challenges. There are mathematical challenges, there are computational challenges, but at the moment, what we still tend to do is look at all of these events in isolation. And I think that's events, nexi, I don't know if nexi is the right term, it's probably nexus. It's not a water energy nexus, it's not a water food nexus, it's not a water disease nexus, it's an all of those nexus. And I think that is something that we can start addressing.
And if we don't, we'll keep coming up with half measures and inadequate solutions.
Yeah, and I mean,
let's transition to that, to the solution set. So let's talk about, so that Global Trends report said all the things you're saying. Like I said, urbanization, population growth, water, climate, confessional groups, identity politics, the rapid spread of more powerful weapons. They're all going to be a problem in 2015, and lo and behold, they are. But we didn't really do anything necessarily. We didn't do nothing, but we didn't create the means to prepare for, prevent, deal with that world. So we are where we are. Are we ready for the 2025 that you all see? And if we're not, if this current government, I personally, just coming out of government, I do not believe that the US government is organized to manage complexity. And the Department of Defense extensively uses modeling and simulation to plan for the future, but I do not believe they use M&S tools to model complexity. I do not think that we're organized. I think it's very difficult to reorganize on an international scale, even harder. And I think all the cry you hear today about we don't have a strategy, we need a strategy, at bottom is really discomfort with complexity. And the fact that the world won't yield to a single straight line linear strategy. That's my opinion. Now let's hear yours.
Can I jump in on that?
Please.
So, I like that you started with sort of predictions for today. And some of those predictions didn't play out, right? The prediction that South Africa and indeed most of sub-Saharan Africa would be dominated by AIDS. It's not to say it's not a major challenge still. Why is that the case? Well, it's the case in part because of some, a coming together, a sort of bipartisan coalitions that are unheard of here in Washington these days, but one that invested in reorganizing the American government and reorganizing global institutions to respond to this challenge. So what did that look like? Well, in terms of the United States government, it had to do with single-minded focus on clear targets and outcomes in a way that frankly isn't commonplace, not just in the development space, but in most areas. And in terms of elevating to sort of presidential level interest and organizing in a new sort of interagency model through this. I'm talking about PEPFAR, George W. Bush's plan for AIDS relief. But the second thing, which is just as important, is the invention of a new global institution, which is based on a multi-stakeholder model of governance, right? So no longer just having governments at the table, but having the NGOs like the Doctors Without Borders that I mentioned earlier, having corporations like some of the companies that are sort of investing in these new pharmaceuticals, having foundations like the Gates Foundation, that's one of the biggest players in the global health context now, as well as folks from the global south. So it's really a new model of governance to respond to these challenges, both at the global level and at the national level. So they sort of match this at the national level to try and create new conversations. It's this kind of multi-stakeholder approach to governance that I think could be quite valuable in building out institutions to deal with water, perhaps to deal with issues about urban climate change as we move forward in terms of thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm actually optimistic that we have emerging models out there. I just think that we're not applying what we've learned broadly enough.
How about you, Troy? What do you think?
So I would align myself with this idea that sort of strategic success in the future is a function of sort of competitive coalition building, putting together these complex coalitions of state and non-state, public and private actors. Be able to do that more quickly, organize it, mobilize it, put it into action more so than those you're competing with, whether that's an adversary like ISIL or it's a natural disaster like or a disease epidemic. So, and I think we have models of that in the past and in the present that have worked. We've seen it in response to natural disasters in the past. We've seen us rapidly mobilize a coalition to deal with ISIL today, but I think there's going to be more of a premium on that in the future. And frankly,
Can
the
you
U.S.
be more specific now about what that means for the armed forces? How do they have to organize then to deal with this? Like, with Ebola, we can do that, right? But we're not organized for it.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say we're not organized for it. I mean,
Is
I
it
think
the right tool going forward?
I think the U.S. military historically has proven to be a remarkably versatile tool and very responsive. And I think the Ebola is a case where the speed, reach, industrial strength of the armed forces was the right tool to rapidly sort of mobilize and provide a platform and lay down some capabilities that then could be transitioned over to just more of a civilian capability. And it was done in support of the lead government agency, USAID, and with all of these other partners like global communities and lots of other NGOs and IGOs. So in some respects, setting aside the timeliness of the response, the model, I think that's the kind of model that will work in the future. So for the military, I think that puts a premium not on a lot of specialization, but on versatility and responsiveness.
So tell me what that means for force structure. If you could, talk to the chairman and say, here's what you need to do when you wave your wand. What is in 2025? Is there a different force structure or force posture? Do we need a different military?
I don't think we need a fundamentally different military. I do think that it would be sort of irresponsible not to prepare to defend the nation from high-end conventional or nuclear warfare. I think that's always been the case, and that will remain true. But in preparing for that kind of threat, I think you will then also need to preserve and prepare some of the capabilities that you will need to deal with some of these more transnational, non-traditional security challenges. And frankly, the key to that, to me, is not necessarily the technology or even the force structure, but it's the leadership development. And I think that's really what the U.S. military brings to bear in a way that few others do, and that is leaders that are adaptive and agile and can combine capabilities or draw on capabilities like our tremendous medical capacity or logistics capacity and bring that to bear rapidly, as we did in the case of Ebola.
If I can
Yeah,
just add
please.
to that. So, I mean, I think the other component there, I agree with you, the sort of the traditional threats are not going away. We have to make sure that we account for those. But I think overall, we can be a lot more strategic in our response instead of tactical. So the response to Ebola was actually quite well executed, but it was very much tactical. It was a crisis that needed to be responded to right away. If we plan for things in advance, if we have a set of risk maps, if we have a set of these interconnected type of relationships between various potential threats, there's an opportunity for us to get in there earlier and be prepared. And that's why, the reason climate change is scary is because it's also takes away our forces from the threats that may be emerging and require tactical response, right? Dealing with the hurricanes, dealing with extreme weather, dealing with earthquakes, dealing with nuclear meltdowns because of earthquakes and tsunamis. All of that takes away from the need to still respond to those tactical threats. And I mean, to be fair, one of the things that I think is really important, and I resonate with Troy, is the leadership has to recognize this. So this notion that we need to be more strategic in our planning is something that must be recognized at the highest levels. And to be honest, the Quadrennial Defense Review, one of the 3 pillars of our defense strategy is build security globally. So it is clearly recognized in the top level strategy document of the Department of Defense. Are we doing that? That's another question. I think
Who would be doing that? If we were going to be building security, do we have the civilian expeditionary capacity to do it?
So I think it requires cross-agency, private, academia.
Century product of the post-World War II era. It's an intrastate institution. It's pretty hard to turn those into multi-stakeholder institutions. We don't have a lot of examples of that. We have more examples of 21st century institutions, especially in the health context, but not only in the health context, which are embracing this model. So, when we think about some of the water challenges, I think that might be a good candidate for a new set of institutions internationally. Within the government, I think one of the issues that I've seen, on the sort of development side of this is that the integration right now of state and AID puts pressure on the sort of shorter term planning. It can be helpful in current operations in the way that Nadia mentioned, but it can get even within the government, I think, away from thinking about these longer term drivers of climate or emerging disease.
Can you talk a little bit, Nadia, about some of the work you're doing on climate change with social media?
Sure. So I guess to your earlier question, I think it is possible to reorganize an institution. Our president, Michael Crow, has done it pretty successfully, I think. So
it's a big institution.
Yes, so, yeah. So and actually, I mean, to be honest, the restructuring a university and restructuring agencies towards a more multi-mission orientation is not. I would claim it's not that different. It's rather a significant restructuring. So if we talk a little bit about this holistic approach to understanding and tracking some of these risks. So what the tendency is to completely separate the models from the real-time analytics or real-time analysis of what's going on the ground from the historical past of what has happened. And some of the research that's ongoing presently at ASU is actually to combine all 3 of those domains. So you have this seamless interaction between the past, the present, and the future to allow you to navigate through various spaces. I'll give you a semi-concrete example. So one of the things that we're looking at is scarcity of water. A good example of that is, of course, the Southwest. Well, of course, one of the things that you can do is you can actually track social media as to the reference to the word drought or reference to the word scarcity or flood or something like that. And what that actually allows you to do is look at the framing of the dialogue on the ground. So what is framing? Using certain types of keywords to encourage or discourage a certain interpretation. So what does that actually mean? What does that actually mean from an implementation perspective? Well, if you can look at the Southwest and project 30 or 40 years out and realize that there's going to be a significant drought, and you know that the framing of the discourse is focused on, say, need for investment in infrastructure or need for new policy, you know what sort of implementation will actually be more effective on the ground. The other component to this is you can actually use social media as almost like a temperature in absence of real data. So you may not be able to go in and measure scarcity in detail in every single country, but you can get it as essentially, a test. How is it going? Are people worried about this? And sometimes what's interesting, so there's research that people forget things very fast. So for example, we were looking at California and Arizona, and we do have significant drought issues, and there was a period of rain, and all of a sudden everybody stopped talking about drought, right? And drought is a long-term strategic problem. It doesn't go away with one period of rain. So that's just a little bit of an example.
That's great. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So, yes, we have one right here. Yes. If you wish to be recorded for all time, yes.
That's about 10%. So sometimes in our work, we say that rather than substituting for private capital as it needed to do in the past, government needs now to leverage private capital, because what the private sector can do well is bring things to scale. That's one example and a model of thinking about it. But rather than, I'd like to ask you to take a step further than we need complex coalitions. What are those roles? What are those responsibilities, and how do they necessitate us to change the way we may think about those people?
So our government's becoming leverage and catalyst instead of the driver? Is that just reality? I mean, but it doesn't seem to be right now. But
Go ahead.
Let me pick up on that theme. So as we're thinking towards a new set of goals, right? Integrating development and the environment, sustainability, sustainable development goals. One idea that I think could have great value is to try and leverage private finance, especially bond finance, for cities, because cities are the drivers of our emissions. They're also the drivers of our economic growth. And yet the reality is, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example, only Dakar, outside of South Africa, has actually been able to have any bond issue. And they were only able to do that because USAID helped support it. So why don't we think more broadly about the kind of green investments to deal with these water shortages, to deal with some of the health infrastructure? But to do that, frankly, it won't happen by itself. You do need government to incentivize, to leverage, sometimes to back these kinds of financings, and we may need new forms of global cooperation to do it. So I think you're quite right that that's an avenue to look at, and I think it sort of feeds into the kinds of conversation we've been having.
Let's have some more commentary on that, but also if you would now morph it into sort of your closing thoughts. So if you would, about where we're going to be in 2025 and how we do this, how we create these coalitions that will allow us to govern in that world.
So I guess one of the very specific things in terms of partnerships, I do think there's a tremendous opportunity for very strong partnership within the government with the Department of Defense intelligence community and USAID. I mean, that just a short personal anecdote. When I started at ASU, I was working on a lot of defense-related issues, and literally my next door office mate was focused on development and USAID. And for about 4 months, we did not talk at all except say hi to each other in the hallway. And then 4 months into my tenure there, we sort of were in a meeting together, and we realized we were thinking about exactly the same thing. Exactly the same things. And if you think about something that I said earlier, so phase 0 operations, pre-kinetic operations, our development operations. So very strong collaboration there, I think, is something that is both necessary and possible. And I guess from a closing point perspective, so one of the things that Sharon sent to all of us in preparation for this was sort of, can we end on a positive note? And to be honest, not to sound Pollyanna and all, I really think we can. I think everything that I'm hearing from both partners within the US and international discussions that we've been having with partners outside of the US, there's this general understanding at very high levels that there's this need for cooperation and collaboration. And I think we all understand that we don't live in like this closed all society, and we have to work together in the presence of uncertainty, in the presence of wickedness, to address these challenges together. And to be honest, that's the only way we're going to be able to do it.
Troy, last thought?
Well, I certainly agree with that. I'd begin with, first of all, it's about relationships, and the United States is well positioned in that regard globally, because our diplomats, our development professionals, our service members are out there in every part of the world. And that's important that we sort of build on those relationships so that we can actually rapidly mobilize these coalitions. I think there's some real practical things we can do. We can share information more. We can take more risk with information sharing. It's something we have a comparative advantage in as a nation and as a government. And it's a low-cost, high-impact way to build trust. And we keep these coalitions together. And the other thing I would add is this ideas, even as we develop sort of these sophisticated capabilities to fight kind of high-end wars, they still have to be able to plug and play with people that can't keep pace. So we put a premium on interoperability. I think we also got to think about sort of cooperability, capabilities that allow people that don't quite have an F-22 or an F-35, but be able to communicate and integrate so that when we are using our military, we can do it with a bigger coalition.
So we have to build the enabling platforms to have these kinds of pop-up coalitions. Yep. David, any last thoughts?
Yeah, just quickly, thanks for having this panel. I think it's really important to keep this focus on long-term drivers of insecurity. I think it's important to remember the role of the United States in the past and potentially in the future in catalyzing the kinds of global cooperation institutions I was talking about. And lastly, to think about leveraging non-state actors as allies in solving these problems, even as in the short term, obviously, we need to address those non-state actors who are causing problems.
Well, this is a great panel, and I would ask you to applaud them not just for what they said to you today, but for the fact that all three of them are actually walking the walk, and they're trying to do and prepare for that future and help prepare this country for how to be successful in a more complicated future. So these are practitioners and thinkers, and let's give them a hand.
Thanks.